Alrighty, so welcome to session 2 for Shield Ignite Scorch. So we already covered sort of doing the quick survey, but for anybody who's interested, you can join and just finish that off as we're getting into the session. Quick overview. So we're going to do a quick refresher, talk about some of the stuff that we talked about last time, and then from there we're going to cover a little bit more advanced CSS, and then we're going to talk about sort of ways of organizing our CSS to make it a bit easier. As always, slides are going to be available on the websites, and you can find the links to those there. And you can also find the exercise files at the link that's right there as well. So from last time, we talked about HTML and CSS. So HTML basically provides kind of the structure and the layout for sort of what your page looks like. And then CSS kind of defines how it actually looks. And so HTML had a start and an end tag. It had some of that inner content, and then it had some attributes. And then when you're looking at CSS, we talked about some stuff like color, sizes, that sort of stuff when we're looking at just some of the basics. So first question that we have here is which page corresponds to the HTML that we see just down in this corner here? So we'll give you guys a minute or so to check that out. Let's bring it back up there. So in this case, it would be C. So basically, this is what it would look like. I believe the question on top hat is a bit different, so I don't know. I assume it's still C on top hat, but I'm not sure because I can't see them. So, but yeah, essentially in here, one of the big things to keep in mind is that some people don't name their CSS stuff properties very well. So even though this says .dark, they've actually made it white. So just keep that in mind, is that sometimes you'll run into people who will give properties different names. So like in this case, we actually have the background color being black in this case, but there's people who will leave things like .dark and then they'll make it like color red. You know, like I don't know why this is called dark, but sure, okay. So just keep that in mind when you're dealing with CSS classes. Okay, and then we have a second question here, so I'll let you guys go through that on top of it. Perfect. Okay, so generally speaking with that refresher, the main thing to look at is, especially when you're looking at something like this, where everything's all together, trying to put everything into a div can make this sort of thing kind of easier because you can just have everything grouped together. It's kind of the whole point of a div. So you can just do that, and then you just have to change the color for that one element. And then from there, the other changes that were there, you can basically add in just the sans serif changes, which is just the UL and then sans serif. So super easy. What we'll get into now is a little bit more advanced CSS. So this isn't necessarily more advanced in terms of more difficult. It's just more advanced in terms of like the features and stuff like that that are a little bit more interesting. So the first one is what are called pseudo selectors. So one of the fancy things about CSS is that, as we've seen before with the attributes and all that sort of stuff, CSS is a lot of your HTML is going to be dealing with elements that have their own sort of state. So you can have things like elements that have attributes. You can have a link that has an href, all that sort of stuff. On top of that, you can have different states for what the person is doing with that element at a time. So when we're looking at something like this, if we have an anchor tag, for example, if we do a and then the anchor tag, and then we have hover afterwards, we can basically say, okay, when the element is in this specific state, we want it to do something. So we can say, for example, in this case, what it's saying is that you can see here in this GIF, whenever you come across and you hover over it, it's going to go green. There's a whole bunch of these different ones. You can use them for a bunch of cool stuff. You can use them, for example, if there's like a button, you can hover over it and then it like pulses if you want to show that you can click the button. You can do things like whenever people will hover over certain like sections of the page, for example, it might highlight their cursor. There's a whole bunch of other fancy things that you can do with this. Hover is one of the main ones people tend to use this for, but there's also things like if you have checkboxes on a form, you can check to see if somebody has checked it off. And then if they've checked it off, you can make it green, that sort of stuff. So lots of fancy stuff that you can do with these. Hover is going to be the main one that you're going to want to focus on though for today. Another cool tool is what is called a media query. And so essentially a media query is just same sort of idea as checking your pseudo classes, where you can check to see if there's like a hover state or anything like that, except for this is going to be for the whole sort of browser window that you're looking at. So media queries will be able to check things like what size the person's screen is, or whether or not they have the page open, that sort of stuff. So media queries are great. There's sort of some more details you can find here, but there's lots of other cool things you can do with them. Like, for example, change your CSS so that when you're going through, you can have certain CSS stuff that only works when people are at certain screen sizes. This is why, for example, when you go on certain websites, you might see that as you bring a screen in and make it a little bit smaller. So if, for example, if I grab the Shield Ignite site, oops, Shield Ignite, If I grab this, for example, and I start making the screen a little bit smaller, as I start going smaller and smaller, you'll see that the buttons started stacking, but when it's wider, they stay up there. So start going smaller and smaller, you see they get smaller with it as well, essentially. So they change to match sort of the environment. And so this is what you can do in CSS as well. We have the little thing in here. VS Code should autocomplete a lot of this for you. So you should be able to do @media and then just put in brackets whatever your thing is. This is basically like an if statement. So the @media, you can think about it kind of like saying if, and then we could say something like max width is 600 pixels, for example. Order does matter, so keep that in mind. As you're going down for max width, you want to make sure that you're you're going down as you sort of go down. CSS is read from top to bottom. So if you don't do this, what will end up happening is that if you say the max width is 300 at the top here, and then the max width is 900, both of them are true, but the 900 comes after the 300. So then it'll read the 900 as being more important. So just keep that in mind when you're reading it. So for example, in this case, when we're looking at this, where we have 300 right here, it's going to always be for EM because this 900 pixels is true for every one below here. So just keep that in mind as you're reading through this. Minimum width is the same thing, but backwards. Instead of being your sort of maximum, you have your minimum, essentially going from there. Order matters for this as well. So just make sure that you have your order in the correct sort of layout when you're going through it. And if you're wondering about this and you're running into problems, basically, if you do it and you find those problems, come back to these slides and you can see basically which order you want it in. Another cool type of media query that we have is one called print. This isn't going to be useful for a lot of things, but when it is useful, it is super handy. This lets you tell if somebody's trying to print your page. So if you didn't know this, when you come to a browser, you press Control P, you can print off a page. This is what it looks like when you try and print off a page, for example, right? One of the things this is really cool for is if you have a resume, it means that you can just send like a URL to somebody who you want to have your resume, and then they can hit Control P and they have a PDF copy of your resume that they can then take around, print off, do whatever they want with. So this can be super handy for doing stuff like that. Here's an example at the UFC where everything sort of changes and shifts up to one side. And it also makes sure to include, for example, these links here. It includes the URL these links go to on there as well. So it's kind of cool. It's not necessarily the most useful thing all the time, but it's super handy in situations where you need it. Screen is the opposite. It's the default that you run into. Everything is screen by default, and then you specify if you want print instead. So with that, what we're going to do is basically using that max or min width, you want to go through and use media queries to have it so that you can see here, as we get to 50, as we get to, down to 500 pixels, we want it to go from something that takes up 100% width down to 50. So we'll give you guys a chance to try that out. Keep going then. So with this, I'll just quickly walk through doing this. So essentially this is kind of what it looks like by default. We just have this like 100% width section here. So we can see that's the CSS for it. That's basically a div with 100% width. And we can see that's where that div is right here. So all that we have to do for this is same thing that we talked about before. So we add @media, and then we put in sort of whatever our condition is going to be for our if statement. And in this case, it's going to say whenever we hit 500 pixels as a maximum width, we want to anything below 500 pixels, we want it to go to 50% width on the div. And so we can just add that in there. And when we come in here and start shrinking it, when we get to 500 pixels, it'll go to only taking up 50% of the width. So yeah, hopefully all of that makes sense. All right, display. So display is basically a way that you can tell elements how they should interact with other elements on the page. So mainly what this is used for is to decide whether or not elements should show up next to each other or if they should break and go to a new line. So as we've seen with a lot of the elements that we're looking at here, for example, like this default page that we have here, every element kind of takes up a new line. Like the image is here and then the text comes after it, and then everything comes after and after and after and after, right? But what happens if we wanted to, for example, have some stuff kind of show up on the same line together, right? So this is where something like display would be used. So display type block is the default. And so essentially you can just say display block and you'll get this where you have text on top, text on the bottom, and they sort of stack on top of each other as if they were sort of blocks. They basically say like, nope, we're kind of like magnets, we're repelling each other. You're going on a new line. There we go. Inline, however, lets you have things side to side. So basically what it's saying is instead of making them a block, their own sort of discrete block, we're going to put them so that they're in line with each other, essentially, as we go. And so you'd get the two pieces of text right on top of each other like that. An inline block is essentially the same thing, except for the only major difference that you have is that you can set the width and the height explicitly. So instead of, if you just pick inline normally, and then you say like, hey, I want my width to be 500 pixels, it won't be 500 pixels. It'll be whatever the default is. If you do want it to be 500 pixels, you choose inline block instead, essentially. And so what we're going to do is there's a default page that we have available here, which is under display type starter. And it looks kind of just like this. And it's just going to load the pages. And what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and make it look like this example that we have down here. So we're going to give a couple minutes to give that a whirl. I'll resume the recording. Okay. So from the code that we kind of started with, which is what we have here, one of the big things was the, you can kind of cheat with this one because I gave you the comments that were there. But essentially, these first two elements here, it said that it wanted them to line up next to each other. So what we can do for that is we can make sure to have the display set to inline so that they'll line up next to each other. This width gets ignored when we do that as well. So that'll make sure that this image and this first bit of text here, where they're currently separated, we go to the example one, they're now next to each other when we do that. For stacking the elements vertically, we basically managed to set our display to block. And then once we go ahead and do that, then they go from being next to each other because they were originally set to inline to now being stacked on top of each other, just like that. And then at the bottom, we wanted 3 of them lined up next to each other, but we specifically wanted them to take up a certain amount of space. And so that's where inline block comes in. So we can set inline block and then we can set a width and it'll respect that width that we provided. So right down here, it's kind of hard to tell because this, because this is kind of bigger. But if I go ahead and make this smaller down here, you can see here that they're in sort of a 33 split there. All right, so now next kind of cool thing that you can use is CSS variables. One of the coolest things about this is that just like regular variables, you can make this so that they change constantly. So you can see here, I have a button where you can change the theme. And when you click that, all that it does is it loads new variables. So as long as you're using these throughout your CSS, you can basically make it so that you can load whatever you want, whenever you want, essentially. And so if we're looking at something like this, the way that you define them is you can define them using your body or your root. So this is like a custom element that exists that's specific to variables. You don't really use this for anything else, but you either do colon root or body. And then from there, you define whatever your variables are. So typically what most people tend to do is they do these 2 dashes and then whatever the variable name is here. So if we go ahead and we have something like primary color, then we can include that in here by saying var, and then we just put in whatever the name is. So our color down here is being set by primary color. So when this loads in our browser, it'll look at this and then it'll go back to our primary color and it'll load this value right here. So just like regular variables, except for they're useful for CSS. This is super handy because what it means as well is that people can release things like theme packs. So a lot of CSS frameworks that you'll use down the road will have like theme packs where they'll have like -- primary. Actually, this is exactly what we have on Visual Ignite sites. So if I go ahead and I pop this open, we can look here in the elements of something like the body and then pull up the styles. And we can see in here, we have, the specific blue that we want to use, the specific red, all that sort of stuff. And then we can say like our primary transparent colors, all that sort of stuff. So you can see here, we have a ton of variables. If we ever wanted to change just the colors, like say, for example, we want to do something like a Christmas theme for some reason, we would literally just have to have a CSS file that comes in and basically just has this root and then changes whatever variables you want to change. And that would be how you could load in a theme, for example. So tons of systems use this, and it allows you to basically load custom colors, custom fonts, custom whatever, and it's super handy to use. You can also do this, by the way, with padding and with anything else, any of these measurement stuff. If you have a cool gradient that you set up, because gradients are kind of a pain to set up in CSS, you can do all of that stuff. Like anything you really want, you can set to a variable for the most part. The main uses is, it lets you create themes easily, lets you have updates super easily, and then you have base values that you can calculate from. So if you want to change the color of something, or you want to change the size of something based on the size of something else, if you do it with variables, both of them will update at the same time whenever you make a change to one. So it can be super handy for doing all that sort of stuff. So in here, we have an exercise, I believe it's called CSS variables. And so essentially, if we go ahead and pop this open, this is kind of what it looks like right now. If we click change theme, nothing happens. And so what they want to happen is that whenever they click on change theme, it'll go through and it'll show up. So we have 3 different steps we'll need to do here. We'll have to create the variables for the existing colors on the page and then add them to the body. So in this case, you won't want to use root, you want to use body, and then replace the colors on the page with whatever variables you want, and then add them to a specific selector. So if we come in here, I'll just show you kind of the start of this. If we look at something like this would be where you'd want to put in your dark colors would be inside here. So whenever it switches to the dark theme, you'll want to put that in there. And then everything else will go inside this body section here. You'll want to set up your variables there. Okay, so we'll give you guys a couple minutes to try that out. Okay, let's go right there. And there we go. Okay, perfect. All right. So next we're not going to look at this. If you're interested, you can take a look at this on your own time. This is kind of a more advanced topic. So if you are interested, you can take a look at it. So the thing at this point is we have a whole bunch of CSS we can do. We kind of have like these different tools that we kind of have to do things, but we don't really know like how to actually like do anything with them necessarily. Like we can kind of build these little small different things, but how do we actually like build a web page? Like what do you actually do for that? And so this is often called the blank canvas problem. Essentially, when you start with any sort of possibility in the world, it gets really hard to figure out what you kind of want to do. And so what you typically want to do is you kind of want to limit your scope and put some constraints in place so that it can be a little bit easier to work with. And one of those really good constraints is what's called a design system. So this, for example, is Google's material design. So you can see here, this whole page kind of looks nice. And that's because they have a whole bunch of rules for how they designed everything that's on this page. And there's a bunch of rules about how it works. And most importantly, there are a bunch of little Lego pieces they use to build everything up together. So you can see down here, we kind of have this like information where it's all grouped together about like, for example, this news post. We can see here, we have like this title, and then we have this image here, and we have this text. And it's all kind of grouped together. So when you hover over it, it goes a little bit blue. And then when we click inside of it, we kind of have the same sort of thing where it's more cohesive. We can see, okay, this is the title, this is all that sort of stuff. So how do we actually build something like this out? Well, that particular component is what's called a card, for example. So if I come into cards, we can see here, this is kind of what a card looks like. There's a whole bunch of different information about how you can build out cards and how they work. And that's kind of the component that you would use. And so the way design systems can work is it's essentially kind of like you get a bunch of Lego pieces that you build, and then you put them together like a Lego set, essentially, is the way to think about it. And so this is what's called the component model. So houses are complicated, but people tend to build them one blanket wood at a time. You don't just kind of chuck a ton of bricks to the wall and hope that they all stick. Web pages are complicated. We shouldn't just try to build like literally the entire web page all at once. You want to build up little pieces at a time, and then from those pieces, you can use those to solve certain problems. So here, for example, these pages that you're looking at right now all use the same components from actually the same CSS framework library. So they all use pretty much the exact same stuff, but they look completely different. And the reason why is because the components that they're using solve particular problems. And so they can be reused different ways. And then you just slightly change the way that that specific component looks, and then you get completely different outcomes. So for example, if we're looking at something like the University of Calgary, for example, this is using the same sort of a navigation bar that you see at the top here that you would see on Shulk Ignite. It's using the exact same thing. It's actually the exact same library that they're using for both of them. It's just styled a little bit differently, but they're both solving the same problem. And so what that means is that you build out your navigation bar one time. And now when I go to like this page, for example, I don't need to rebuild out my navigation bar. I can reuse it. I can reuse a bunch of the elements that I'm using in different sections and then reuse them over and over again. So you essentially build up these different pieces that solve certain problems. And then from those pieces, you build up your total web page. And so a component more broadly is just kind of a set of HTML and CSS that are designed to work together. So like I said before, they're just different pieces that are designed to be put together. So for example, let's say we have an FAQ page that we have a ton of text on. When we're looking at this page, there's a bunch of different questions that are being asked in here, and there's a bunch of different answers. They're kind of long. It's a long scroll down to find what you want, right? If you want question 5, you got to scroll down through all these different sections to try and find it. So how do we make this a bit easier? Well, what are the actual problems that I'm running into? Well, I'm being bombarded by a bunch of text that I don't necessarily care about. It takes me a while to find what I want. And if I refresh, I got to scroll through all of that nonsense again to find what I'm looking for. So I'm looking for something that's smaller, but will allow me to also get the information that I'm looking for. And so this is where something like an accordion comes in. So accordions are something that are commonly built. Sometimes they're called sections as well, although that's not a good name for them because sections has another meaning in other stuff. But this is kind of what you could use to solve this problem, where essentially when you click it, it gives you the text that you want for that question. But when you don't want to see everything, you don't see it, essentially. And so sometimes they're called collapses as well. And so you'll find these in a ton of different design systems and a ton of different CSS frameworks. And so if you build up your own accordion, now you can reuse it across different websites, and now you can use it as a piece that you can use in things like FAQs, or if you have long documentation that has a bunch of FAQs at the bottom of it, you might want to put that in there as well. Or if you just have a bunch of information in general that isn't applicable to everybody who's going to the page, you might want to use something like an accordion. So this is what it looked like before. This is what it looks like after. So I can basically see the first 8 questions, for example, on this page on the right-hand side immediately, whereas before, if I look on the left-hand side, I have to scroll through. I get like 1, maybe 2 questions on the page. So much easier for me to find what I'm looking for directly. Accordion's out in the wild. So this is the University of Calgary. This is Canadian coding, and this is for Julia Knight. So these sorts of things are used by a whole bunch of people. It's the same concept. It's just slightly different designs for the exact same sort of component that's used. There's some other advantages as well. If you fix bugs on one of your components, you fix them on all of your components, which is super handy. You have reusable code snippets that you can use across projects. If you're using the same sort of layout, you can use it across different projects. Easy to change sort of configuration options, especially with CSS variables. You can make it so that if it's using CSS variables that are pretty consistent, you just change those variables, and now your components work with all those variables as well. So it's super easy to use, and it takes reduces the amount of time that it takes for you to ship out something. And so there's two different ways that people tend to use components. So there's semantics or class-based. And so semantic is basically a fancy name for just HTML elements. So essentially what you do is you just build HTML. You don't put anything fancy on it. You don't do anything different. You literally just use HTML, the way it was intended. So you just basically go through, you build out whatever HTML you want, and then those components just sort of are built on top of the HTML spec directly. So nothing fancy. You just use it as it is. So Pico CSS is a very popular framework for doing this. So if I go ahead and click on this, and I look at, for example, in the documentation, all this stuff is all built using just straight up HTML. There's nothing else fancy. There's no fancy sort of like selections or anything like that you have to do. Everything's all built normally. The other alternative is what's called a class-based system. So Bulma, which we have right here, is another example of it. And so if I'll grab just Bootstrap as another really popular example. Bootstrap documentation. If we look at something like Bootstrap, we might have something like an accordion, which is right here that we were talking about before. And the accordion has all of this different code in it. So you can see here, there's classes, and there's a bunch of other stuff that's inside of here to indicate what specific parts of the accordion you're targeting when you're trying to create stuff. This gives you a ton of different flexibility, but also 9 times out of 10, it's a little bit more than you need for a lot of stuff, which is why something like Pico CSS is really nice, because Pico CSS, in order to create an accordion, you literally just do exactly what we saw there, where if we go to get started and I go to components and go to accordion, Pico CSS and accordion is literally this details tag and then a summary tag inside of it. That's it. That's the entirety of how you build an accordion in here. There's less configuration options, but it's also simpler. So there's a trade-off with both, but super handy. So the code is much longer, but you also often have more sort of configurability built into it. Here's kind of a pros and cons of both of them. If you're interested, you can take a look at this later on as well. So what we're going to try and do now is we're going to try and build kind of a class-based component together, just to show kind of what it looks like. So there's some tips that I can give you before we start. One thing you could do to make it much easier for yourself is add comments and code before and after whenever you're building a component. So if I'm, for example, I'm going to build in something like an accordion, I might do something like, if I go ahead and open this up, I might do something like start accordion. And then I might do something down here like end accordion. And the reason for this is, let's say that my accordion ends up, like, for some reason down the road, I end up building an accordion that has like 16 divs inside of here. There's a whole bunch of divs, there's a whole bunch of other nonsense, right? If I want to be able to copy and paste this, literally all I need to do is look for these comments, and I can just go copy, paste. There we go. And now I have 2 accordions, now I have 3 accordions, all that sort of stuff. So that's why I recommend adding in those comments, because it makes it easier for you down the road to be able to just copy paste what you want. Use simple names. Don't be clever. You're not going to like yourself later on down the road if you try and be clever. Trust me, it just doesn't go very well. Try and make configurations in a separate class. So for example, if you have something like you want to make text like way bigger, changing all H2s to make every H2 bigger sometimes can be a problem. You might just want to add a text. You might want to add a class called .bigText that just makes the text bigger, because you might not want every H2 to be bigger, for example. So just keep that in mind when you're going through. Try and make them as little code as possible. That just makes it easier on you. And generally speaking, you can make components out of other components. So you might want to make, for example, like with those FAQ questions where we had the accordions, you might want to make a separate like FAQ component that uses a bunch of accordion components inside of it, just to make it easier for you to have these sort of like components that use other components, essentially. So here's kind of what we're looking towards building towards. Some of the CSS in this is a little bit more complicated. And so the big thing to take away from this is, because it is complicated, this is why we're building it into a component, because we only have to figure it out one time, is basically the whole purpose of using a component. So we got to start with a name, we got to start with a plan. So in our case, we're going to say an aligned image, because basically what we want is we want to have an image on one side, we want to have some text on the other side, essentially. And then we want to be able to flip them around so we can do left and right, right and left, whatever, right? And so we also want the text to be vertically aligned, so we want to show up kind of like off to one side, but like next to where it should be, essentially. So here's kind of what our component might look like to start with. We have the start aligned image, we have the end aligned image, And you can see here already, just making the basic layout, we have a whole bunch of divs showing up there. And as you're dealing with code like this, one of the nice things about VS Code is you can really get rid of a lot of the noise. So if I'm looking at something like this, for example, where I have a whole bunch of these divs and whatever inside of it, and I'm like, I have no idea what's happening here. Let's say I don't care about these product details sections. I know what it does, but I don't need to see it. I can just come across here and I can do what's called code filtering. So I can click this little drop down, that stuff's gone. Maybe I don't care about the rest of the products. Okay, I'm gonna collapse those. I'm gonna make this easy for myself. Okay, I see I've got a couple of products here. That's all that I need to do. And then when I need to get more specific with each of those individual things, I can uncollapse them and then start working on them individually. But it means that you don't have to see, 200 lines of CSS code or like HTML code just directly in your browser all at once. So if I was done with the image and I'd made the image work, I can collapse that. That stuff's done. I know that's finished. I can move on to the content section, for example. So now that we have it set up, this is kind of what it looks like. So the default, I think I have it in here. Let me just quickly see if I can find it. Maybe I don't have it. I think the code might be in the speakers notes actually. But basically this starting image will look like this, where we have a giant image on top and we have some text underneath it. So now we need to basically move everything around. Now that we've kind of figured out what we need to move everything around. The code is a little bit complicated. And the nice thing about having components is that you only have to figure this out one time. So Google away is what I would say. When you're building a component, the easiest way to build a component is start Googling things that you want to build. So if you say, I want to put something to the left and something to the right, and I want it to show up properly. If you know how to use inline, use inline. If you want to do something fancier, Google how it works in that specific thing. This is going to be your friend. This is the way that pretty much everybody does CSS, especially with things like Flex and Grid, which is what I'm using here. I had to Google this entire sort of example. And the reason for that is these are not super intuitive and sometimes you forget which one's which. So basically just going through Googling the things that I want. If I want something to not show up, I Googled what that looks like and then basically added all this stuff in there. So I have all of this sort of CSS code there. And then from that, now I make some other changes to make it look a little bit nicer. And now we kind of have some extra stuff that I added to the end of it. But now we have our elements all set up. It's built up. It works perfectly well. So what that means now is I can just basically copy and paste this code along and into any projects that I want to use, I just copy and paste the same code across and we're good to go. And that's the idea of a component. It's essentially similar to like the idea of an object in Python. You can basically take your code and you can take it with you and move it to where you need it to go. And that's the thing that really matters here. Not the specific example, but the fact that you can take your code and move it to different places and you can go ahead and you can make whatever you want out of those things. So usually a lot of times in development, we want to start from kind of this broad idea and then work into something more specific. Sometimes when you're dealing with creating websites, you want to work the other way around. You want to try and make something like very specific and then use that to build out something more complicated from there. So what we're going to do is there's an exercise in here. So if I go into here, there is this card.html. We can go ahead and we can pop this open. This is kind of what it looks like right now. And what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and focus on creating one card. And so what a card looks like is kind of like this. And so if you go on Google and you just type in, how do I do a shadow in CSS? This will show up for you. And there's actually directly this W3 Schools thing will let you copy and paste the code that you need for this. All you're going to want to do is basically build out one card and just see if you can get that working. So we have the information there. And if you have any questions, you can ask your mentors. You can do the rounding stuff if you want as well. That's just a border radius. So you can go ahead and we'll give you some time to work on trying that. We're going to resume recording and share our screen. Okay. So the nice thing about having something like a card, for example, is that, so here's kind of, I have the card inside here. We can then create a sort of another component, something like a 3-card group. And then we can add in those 3 cards into that 3-card group. And then now, for example, if we ever had a layout where we wanted to have these 3 cards kind of show up, we can just sort of pass that layout around to different projects and go from there. So the nice thing about components, again, is that it's kind of plug and play. So you can have different things that will have other things inside of them. So you can kind of nest them inside of each other, which is super nice. Another example of this, for example, would be on Scorch or on the actual Ignite page. We are using something very similar to that, where we have these cards kind of lined up next to each other, essentially. And there's lots of complicated code to do fancy things. Like, for example, as we get smaller, you'll see that they have mobile support. So as you get smaller and smaller, they kind of shrink down to fill sort of different sizes. So if you're on your phone right now, you'd actually be able to read this text, as opposed to if we kept it the exact same as we did over here, then every one of those things would be like a tiny little square up in the corner somewhere where you wouldn't be able to read it. So being able to have components like that just makes it easier to get more granular and more specific with what you want. So this is the example that I just showed you. And so even with the design systems, CSS, again, it isn't easy. So Googling things for whatever you want is a good way of doing it. The other option as well is taking it from other places that you find. So if, for example, you wanted to know how this accordion actually works, if you right click and hit inspect, you could just go through and you could read things like the CSS that's used directly for this. I would highly recommend doing this, especially when you find sites that you really like, because you'll learn a whole ton about how CSS works by just sort of taking apart somebody else's code that they have. It's one of the great things about the internet is that it's really easy for you to take apart other people's code and be able to understand what you're actually running on your machine. And so as you can see, CSS, sometimes there's a lot of CSS that you run into. The main CSS for the Schulke Knight site, I think it's about 9,500 lines. I can tell you, I was the person who wrote that site. It did not take anywhere near as long as you're expecting. And I think the original prototype took us like 2 weeks or something like that to do. So we did not write that by hand. In fact, we were using what I showed you earlier, which was Bootstrap. And so next week, what we're going to talk about is how to use other people's code more effectively. So how to use projects like Bootstrap, where they have made a whole sort of website in a box system available for you and made it easier for you to just basically go ahead and grab the things that you need and be able to put them in wherever you need to plug them in. So when you want an accordion, for example, instead of spending your time trying to fight with the CSS and trying to get to work exactly how you want it to, you can just come in here and you can go ahead and copy this stick board, for example, and just be able to copy and paste these things in there. This is super handy. This is what most people do when they do development, and it's a way of sort of getting through things much more easily. And so, yeah, it's basically the main thing is that whenever you're sort of doing stuff and you're trying to write your websites, there's a lot of people who kind of have this thing about having to write all of your lines of code. In Python, we use Pygame to set up your games and stuff like that whenever you're doing all of those projects. If you were in the previous Schulke Knight courses. And the reason we did that is because it sucks to write everything from scratch. So websites shouldn't be any different. You shouldn't be running everything from scratch every time. There are common patterns you want to match, and basically doing it this way makes it much easier to do this, because they also will have things in there that you haven't even thought about. Like, for example, what happens when somebody speaks Arabic and Google Translate flips the entire site right to left instead of left to right, and then all of your code breaks. So things like Bootstrap will account for things you've never even heard of in your life. Things like screen readers for people who are blind. Things like people who need high contrast settings or have high contrast settings that are set of windows. All that sort of stuff is all handled by these frameworks, and it's much easier for you to use these frameworks than it is to just try and do all this stuff by yourself. Trust me, as somebody who's written CSS frameworks, you don't want to write a CSS framework. Trust me, your time is more valuable than that. I promise you. And so yeah, they're basically a design system done for you. So essentially they take some sort of a design system, they go through, they implement it for you, and then you can work off of that with the code that they provide for you. And so that's what we will be looking at next week, which will be a much, much easier, much, much faster way of doing things. And it also means it's a much, much more standard way of doing things. Trying to Google, for example, how do I write a card in CSS is kind of a vague and hard to use question. If you're looking at, hey, how do I add an image to a card in Bootstrap? It's a much more simple question that you'll be able to find a lot more answers on Stack Overflow and those sorts of places for you to make it a bit easier for you to understand how this stuff works. So yeah, so next time we'll take a look at that. This also a handy thing about about Bootstrap is that it adds things like mobile support for you. So all the fancy stuff that we were looking at before, all done with Bootstrap. All of the sites we actually looked at today. So if we're looking at, for example, the University of Calgary. So if we go to ucalgary.ca, for example, let's not log into my ucalgary.ca. Calgary.ca. This site was written using Bootstrap, which is what we're going to cover next time. My personal site for my company was written using Bootstrap. The Schulke Knight site was written using Bootstrap. All of these sites, as you can see, look completely different, and yet they're all using the exact same sort of CSS framework on top of it. So there's lots of stuff that you can do with it, and it makes it much easier for you to work with. And so now we're going to talk about the end of session exercise. So we're going to create a couple of pages for a company called Canvas, which is basically a product that lets you paint onto a tablet, and it feels like a real canvas. It's basically the idea. So essentially, it's just a fancy drawing tablet. There's some content that's going to be available in the README. So when you go into end of session exercise and you look at the README file here, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's inside of here. So if we go ahead and, like last time, if we go ahead and hit Control-Shift-V in Visual Studio Code, we'll see here, this is kind of like the introduction that we have. So we have, they're giving you this introductory paragraph that has a bunch of information. You can also just make stuff up. It doesn't really matter. This isn't a real company, so I wouldn't be too worried about it. And essentially what you're going to do for this is you're going to create a couple of pages. So the first page, so I would recommend using Pico CSS. So that was the thing that I talked about earlier. When you're looking at this online, there's an option for Get Started. And what this will tell you to do is download it and then put this in the head of your site. So essentially just copy and paste the spreadsheet across, or, spreadsheet style sheet across, and then link it in there. Alternatively, you can just use this link right here, and this will load it over the internet, which works perfectly well. From there, I'd recommend building out the rest of your layout just using Pico CSS because it's going to be the easy way of doing things. It's just basically regular HTML. So just scroll through the documentation. There's not a whole lot in here when you're looking at it. There's just a couple of different components and stuff like that. So it'll make things a little bit easier for you. And what you're actually going to be building out is sort of a home page like this. So you can see here there's a home page that's kind of asking you for your email address and to sign up for stuff. This doesn't have to work. Like that form section doesn't have to work, but just try and get something where it's like, hey, sign up for our newsletter. You can just have a link, or you can have something like this where it says, enter your email address and sign up for a newsletter. Essentially just a landing page. From there, you'll want to have something like a contact page using something like an accordion or something like that. And then maybe just like a quick form. Again, the form doesn't have to work, doesn't have to do anything. It just has to look like a form. As long as people can understand that what they're supposed to do, that's all that matters. And level 3 is going to be just kind of a page that gives you information about the product. So this will just be a whole bunch of stuff, and there'll be a bunch of information inside that for you that'll let you sort of go through and take a look at that stuff as well. You can also make up stuff if you want to. It's okay. It's not a real product. Nobody's going to come after you. So, yeah. Lastly, we have a survey, and then we're going to go into a breakout room where you can work on any of the exercises that we previously have worked on, any questions you have, and also work on the end of session exercises. So to give you a chance to get a longer time with your mentors to ask more in-depth questions if you want that. But in the meantime, if you guys wouldn't mind filling out the quick survey, I will let Fanny take over so she can sort all that out.